The Australian Open Golf Championship is one of the oldest on the world golf calendar. It started back in 1904, 10 years after the first American Open Championship was played in 1894. Of course, its history does not stretch back to the origins of the most famous Open Championship of them all, the British Open, which was first played at Prestwick in 1860, when Willie Park defeated 7 others and claimed the first championship belt. But just as great names adorn the record books for both the British Open and the American Open title, so they adorn the list of winners of our own Australian Championship. Names like the Honourable Michael Scott and Jack Nicklaus, Ivo Witten and Greg Norman, Gene Sarazen and Norman von Nider, Ozzie Pickworth and Dan Suter. The list goes on. Peter Thompson, Bobby Locke, Arnold Palmer, Kel Nagle, Joe Kirkwood, Carnegie Clark, and the man who has won more times than anybody else, Gary Player of South Africa. There is a ring of magic in all those great names, and the list will grow with the passing of the years, and as the Australian Open title gains further in prestige and recognition.
Fantastic shot from Nicklaus there. A round of 74. Greg Norman wins his second Australian Open Championship, the 1985 National Panasonic Australian Open Champion. Baker Finch is going to take double bogey at 17, so Davis is now the championship leader.
Well, there's the gasp from the crowd around the 18th green.
Davis looks at the scoreboard, he can't believe it.
No.
So Roger Davis is the Open champion, and I think congratulations from everyone, Roger. A fantastic effort. 10 under par.
I begin by asking you what recollections you have of winning your first Australian Open.
Well, that was in 1964 at the Lakes. I played Devlin in a playoff there, and I remember coming to the 16th hole there, and that's where they used to have the old lake hole, where you had the drive. I hit a 3-wood over that. People were wondering whether we could get there with the driver, and I hit a 3-wood, knocked it on the green, and made birdie. Went into the playoff with Bruce, and I'll never forget the next day. I was in Honolulu, and I was waiting for planes to travel over. My first time down down under. Well, it really wasn't the first time successfully down under. And I was on the beach with a couple of friends of mine, and they said, "Hey, how did you come out in that playoff?" And I said, "Well, in about 2 hours I beat Devlin, you know." So I sort of remembered that.
Yeah, well now, what age would you have been when you played that first?
I was 24 then.
Yeah, marvellous. And you went on to win the Open 6 times altogether in Australia, the Australian Open. Do you remember the others, Royal Hobart, for instance?
Well, Carrinup was the second one I won. Let's see, that was, what, about 68? And Gary Player finished second to me there. I remember I played a couple of very good rounds there, if I recall. I think I had a couple of, maybe a couple of 67s, maybe a 65 in there or something. I don't remember, but I played some pretty good rounds of golf. I enjoyed that, the nice golf course. And then I went down to Royal Hobart, played down there. I think Bruce Crampton finished second to me there. I remember coming up on the Sunday of that tournament, and we had 2 inches of snow on the ground. And we got to the golf course, we had snow in the bunkers, and the sort of, it was really very cold, but I won that tournament by about, I think I won that tournament by 7 shots, either 7 or 8 shots. And I had a run there right at that period of time, which was probably some of the best run of golf I ever had. That was 1971. I won there by 7 or 8 shots. I won at Manly the next week by 7 or 8 shots, and went to the World Cup the next week and won that by 7 or 8 shots. So I had 3 pretty good weeks running.
Gary, a record 7 Australian Open Championships. There must be 1 or 2 that really stand out in your mind.
Well, first of all, Tom, I'm so proud to have a record 7 Australian Opens, because the Australian Open is a tournament I'm very proud of. And secondly, Jack Nicklaus got very close, you know. He was breathing down my neck. He's got 6. I don't know if he can ever win another one, but, you know, you can never put it past Jack. But the others that are coming along, and records will be broken. And I've had some wonderful experiences in the Australian Open, memories that I will cherish forever. And one that comes to mind is, I think, most significant, or one of the most significant, is when I flew from the World Cup in Paris one year. Arnold Palmer, Jack Nicklaus, and Bruce Devlin and I were supposed to fly. but we only were going to get to the course 2 hours before we teed off. And Arnold and Jack weren't prepared to do that, and Bruce and I did come, flew all that way, arrived at Royal Melbourne an hour and a half before we teed off. I had never seen the golf course in my life. I had a new set of golf clubs that I'd never used, and won the Australian Open by 8 shots, and Bruce Devlin finished second. So that was really a memorable Australian Open.
Can you recall when the Australian Open ever entered your mind? Was it as an amateur golfer or not until you turned pro?
Well, I remember when we played the Australian Open Royal Queensland Golf Club. I think it was somewhere in the early 70s, 73, 74, and I grew up at Royal Queensland Golf Club, and I was assistant pro there, and I got into the tournament, and I was an amateur at that time. And I'll never forget, I was putting up a pretty sterling performance for an amateur, and I played with Terry Gow the last day, and I don't know, can't remember where I finished, but that's my first recollection of playing the Australian Open. I remember making a turn. I think Sneed won. He won at that time, and I think I was about 4 or 5 shots back, and I played the 10th hole at RQ. I hit in the right-hand bunker and came out and rolled over the green and hit my bag. 2-shot penalty, chipped. I took 9. I think I went 9-6, something like that, and basically took me right out of the golf tournament. But that was my first remembrance of the Open.
Yeah. And how old were you when you turned pro?
I was 21, 76 was my first season on the tour. I went on, played the West Lakes Classic, and the Queensland Open was, I think, my very first pro tournament. In 1976, we played at Kapira Golf Club where John Dyer won. Yeah. And so it was, I remember that very well. Next week I went down to Bateman's Bay and then down the West Lakes Classic. And then lo and behold, was the Australian Open was the next week. And me being the guy who just won the West Lakes Classic, I got thrown with Nicklaus. And I'll never forget that. We were, I've never met Jack before. And I met him one time. He was going down to the driving range and I was coming up, and, we were met on the slope of the Australian. And we got to talking, and we eventually found out that we were being paired together. He was my guy. I idled him. I read all his books and understood them and learnt my golf basically from Jack Nicklaus. And here I am thrust with him the first round of the tournament, and first 2 rounds, and get on the first tee, the old Australian, and just cold top my tee shot. I mean, in front of 30,000 people, 20,000 people, because Jack was there. They were lying down the first fairway.
What do you mean by cold top?
I mean, I cold topped it. I mean, I hit it right into the bush in front of there. The ball went about 30 yards, and Jack looks at me, and I look at him, and I just said, what can I say? I was nervous as all heck, and it was an embarrassing moment for me. I shot 80 that day, and next day I finally came back, shot 72, and from there on in, we got to know each other and became pretty good friends.
The first Open I played in was 1948 at Kingston Heath, when Ozzie Pickworth beat Jim Ferrier there in a playoff. And that was a great thing for us, because here was this big man from the United States coming to overpower our little man, and he won. Pickworth won, which was marvellous. Then the next year, I played in the Open at Kensington at the old Australian Golf Club here, when Pickworth actually collapsed on the last hole. I think he had a 10 or 11. I think he was eventually disqualified for miscounting, but he gave it on that occasion to Eric Kremen. And then the next one was 1950 in Adelaide at Kooyonga, and I finished second to Norman Van Eyder there. In 1951 was my year. I won at Metropolitan in Melbourne.
You were how old then?
I was by then 21. Mm-hmm. And I had actually won the New Zealand Open about a month before that. So it was some kind of a record in the books that somebody held the New Zealand and the Australian Open at the same time.
Now, people in this country talk constantly of your enormous and unequalled achievement by anyone in this country of winning the British Open 5 times, and they don't tend to mention how many times you won the Australian Open.
Well, truthfully, I didn't play in the Australian Open for quite a few years for the reason that it was held in August. Mm-hmm. We used to think that the middle of winter was the only time you could have a championship. And so in the months of August and July and sometimes September, I was away in America or Europe. So I missed quite a number of Opens through the 50s, for instance. So I didn't really play the Open again till about 1960.
You won it again twice?
Well, I won in 1967 at Commonwealth in Melbourne, and I won at Kooyonga again.
That was a playoff, was it not?
Yes, a playoff with David Graham.
Mm-hmm. Can you recall the first Open Championship you played in? Well, yes, I think it was the Open that Billy Bolger beat Gene Sarrazin at Royal Sydney. I think it was in 1934.
1934. Where did you finish in that, do you recall?
No, I think I finished roughly around about 10th or 11th, something like that.
Your first Australian Open win was at Kooyonga, and in fact Peter Thompson ran second to you that year. Can you recall that tournament?
Yes, well, the thing that I do recall about it was that Peter had played his first 9 holes of the last round before I teed off in the afternoon for my last round, and he'd shot 30 on the first 9, which made it very, very difficult for me because the wind had sprung up, and it was a much more difficult course than what it had been in the morning, and it meant that with Peter shooting 30, I still had to concentrate, and fortunately for me, after putting my bunker shot, my second shot in the bunker on the 18th, I played a shot out to about 2 feet, and I holed the putt, and I was a winner by 1.
2 years later at Lake Karrinyup, you set a new Open record of 278. In fact, you were the first man to break 280 in the Australian Open.
Yes, well, that was a very, very pleasing sort of thing too. I think Ozzie Pickworth was then, Ozzie had already won, I think, 3 Australian Opens, hadn't he?
Yes, he had.
I was playing away in Britain at the time when Ozzie was winning the Opens, but I consider Ozzie Pickworth the best fairway wood player I've ever seen, and one of the best and most colourful players Australia's ever had.
He was a magnificent player.
Wonderful.
You equalled that 278 around the East Course at Royal Melbourne the following year in 1953. And you shot 65 in the final round. Can you recall that round?
Yes, I can. I was behind, I think, Peter. Peter was leading me by 2 shots going into the last round, and I think it was the best round of golf I'd played up until that particular time. I played those 18 holes in the last round.
In those days, you know, I was a little bit wild off the tees, and I'd had a lot of opportunities to win, but you know, I got that way. I think I was never ever going to win the Australian Open, and then it just sort of fell into place at the Australian Golf Club. It was well, for me at that particular time, it was the sort of highlight of my career at that time. I think that if my memory serves me right, I think I shot 284, and I think Vic Bulgen, the amateur, he was next on 289, but I think I led from sort of start to finish, but the memory's a bit hazy in the actual tournament itself, you know.
In this modern era, the championship is shared between the 2 great cities on Australia's eastern seaboard, Sydney and Melbourne. It was not always this way. In the early years of the Australian Open, Royal Adelaide was often chosen as host club, and in the years after World War II, the Australian Golf Union invited clubs in Queensland, Western Australia and Tasmania to stage the tournament. But the policy has changed. The last time the Australian Open was played outside Sydney or Melbourne was in 1974. That year, Gary Player won for a record 7th time when the venue was Perth's Lake Karrinyup. The 2-city roster has removed several great courses from the championship, particularly Royal Adelaide. The club's Seton course is a great championship test. There is a certain sadness about its absence from the Open scene. Claude Felsted, a 19-year-old left-hander, won back in 1909. Felsted scored 316 and defeated Dan Suter. He is the only left-hander ever to have won. He was a member of Victoria Golf Club in Melbourne, and when the news came through that he had won, the captain of the club, Dr. S.A. Fewing, hosted a party that went long into the wee hours of next day. News moved slowly in those days. How different it is today. When the Australian Open is played, millions of people in Australia and throughout the world follow the fortunes of the champions through their television sets. Televising golf tournaments is a mammoth task. Cameras cover every hole, and their probing lenses never miss a shot that matters when the Australian Open is being played. Like many contemporary players of his day, Felsted played the 72 holes at Royal Adelaide dressed in a button-up jacket with large side pockets. Most players wore ties with their jackets, and the clubs they used were crude by our present standards. But those clubs had romantic names, like Mashie, Mashie Niblick, Spoon, Baffy and Cleek, while today we pluck 5 irons, 3 irons, 9 irons and even metal woods from our bags. A whole lot less romantic, but nobody would argue that the modern-day golf clubs are a huge advance on the implements our pioneer golfers were forced to use. Often the championship contenders would arrive on horseback or in a horse-drawn jinker. All the major clubs had stables on the premises. At one club, the professionals sought an extra 1 shilling and 6pence to feed the horses. In 1913, there were 2 reasons the Open was switched from the Australian to Royal Melbourne, where Ivo Whitten won his 2nd straight championship. There was a smallpox epidemic in Sydney, and the Australian course had been devastated by heavy rain. In 1928, Fred Popplewell holed in 1 in the last round and defeated Rufus Stewart by 1 shot in the Open Championship with a score of 2.95. It was Popplewell's 2nd title. He won previously in 1925. In 1930, the then Governor-General of Australia, Lord Stonovan, presented a perpetual trophy for the Open Championship. The first winner of the Lord Stonovan Cup was Frank Happy Eyre, who scored 306 around Metropolitan. The Stonovan Cup remains the Open Championship trophy. Although Eyre was the first winner, the AGU has engraved on the cup the names of every successful player back to the first Open in 1904. Today's professional golfer is the focal point of our Open Championship, just as he is at every major golf title throughout the world. Amateur contenders for Open Championship honours are very rare, but it was not always the way. On the first 6 occasions the Australian Open was played, amateurs won 4 times. And in the years between 1904 and 1939, when Jim Ferrier won for the 2nd time, 30 Open titles were played and amateurs won 13 of them, the professionals 17. One fascinating statistic from that 30-year period is that Ivo Whitten, perhaps the greatest amateur of them all, was responsible for 5 of those victories. Ferrier was an amateur when he scored his back-to-back triumphs in 1938 and 39. But in the years since World War II, only 1 amateur has been successful. He was Bruce Devlin in 1960 at Perth's Lake Carignan. The pendulum has swung mightily in favour of the professional, with many young men forsaking the amateur game for the career path offered to the professional golfer. In the early days of the Australian Open, the professional golfer was treated almost like a second-class citizen, and there are several instances when they rebelled against their treatment at the hands of the host clubs. In 1911, at Royal Sydney, where Carnegie Clark won for the 2nd year in a row, a militancy emerged that very nearly saw the professionals go on strike. They complained bitterly at the conditions offered them, which included a tiny dressing room normally used as a bedroom by a club steward. Only 1 jug of water and a very small basin was provided for the 15 professionals, and there were no proper toilet facilities. The professionals were not permitted to enter the clubhouse and were asked to eat in a tent. They were not allowed to share a drink with their playing partners after their rounds. It was the old gentleman and player syndrome that was rife in English cricket and golf at the turn of the century and beyond. The distinction between the amateur and the professional golfer still existed into the late 30s and lingered briefly into the immediate years after World War II. But it has now disappeared without trace, and the professional golfer takes his place anywhere on an equal footing with his amateur partner. Today's top professional is a jet-setter who settles for nothing less than a 5-star hotel, and he can afford it. Funding the Australian Open and keeping its prize money to an acceptable level exercised the minds of the Australian Golf Union in the mid-60s. Until then, gate money provided the Open purse, and if it fell short of the advertised amount, the AGU made it up through its own resources. To keep pace with the demand for increased prize money, the AGU looked to the commercial world for assistance, and for the first time, a naming rights sponsor became involved. The first was the international air carrier Qantas, which sponsored the Open from 1969 to 1974, guaranteeing prize money and also making it much easier for overseas players to come to this country. Qantas also flew in golf journalists from England and America, ensuring the tournament received a wide media coverage internationally. Mr. Kerry Packer and W.D. and H.O. Wills joined forces from 1975 to 1978 for the Bulletin Wills Australian Open. Mr. Packer continued the policy of importing top players from overseas and was responsible for Spanish star Sev Ballesteros playing in the title for the first time. But poor Sev took 85 in a gale in his first round at the Australian. From 1979 to 1981, it was the Dunhill Australian Open. But there was no naming rights sponsor when Mr. Ranald MacDonald and the Age newspaper backed the tournament in 1982 and 1983 through selling multiple sponsorships. National Panasonic held the naming rights from 1984 to 1988, but since then the Australian Open has stood alone without a naming rights sponsor, but backed by multiple sponsorship and the expertise of the International Management Group. The Australian Open is how the purists like it. There is no record of prize money in the first Open, but in 1990 there was a record purse of $600,000 for the professionals.
Is it more complex now than a decade ago when you first became involved with mounting an Australian Open?
Considerably so. There are far more sponsors involved in golf tournaments these days. Much more effort has to go into raising money to provide the big purses that we do. So therefore there's a lot more effort, yes.
And what are the kinds of things which the Australian Golf Union as a body, as distinct from your own personal involvement in tournaments, has to consider when it's projecting the next few years ahead?
Well, we have to give clubs enough notice to prepare themselves, and as you'd be aware, this operation takes a whole year to set up. So clubs need to know 3 or 4 years in advance what their obligations are going to be when mounting the Open.
Everything's so sophisticated today, electronic scoreboards, and the marshalling's different, the ropes. In those days, everybody used to trail behind the poor golfers and they were almost treading on their heels. No, it's very different. But in those days, the field, there was so little depth in the field that you looked for Pickworth, or you looked for Van Eyder, or you looked for Kremen, or then Peter Thompson and Nagel, and really there wasn't much else. But today, I mean, if Greg Norman doesn't win the Australian Open, well, there's a dozen players who are capable of winning. Everything is so sophisticated today, all these hospitality marquees and so forth. I mean, this is big commercial promotion in sport, and golf is as big as any of them.
Well, there have been tremendous changes in the press facilities. I can remember an Open Championship once at Kingston Heath where the only telephone was in the ladies' locker room. And we had this extraordinary experience of having to go to the window of the ladies' locker room and have a lady push the telephone through. We would do our dialing and phone the story through and put it back and come back next deadline. And now, of course, we have batteries of telephones and computers and so on to help us. And it's a lot easier now than it was.
I understand you have sketched Australian Open winners for decades. Is that true?
It goes really back 1930, and every golf champion of the Australian Open I have sketched. It goes back from that 30, that's, what is it, 50 odd years ago.
It's the new technology. We just expect now, if a Greg Norman or somebody plays a brilliant golf shot or holes in one, that you'll see it instantly replayed. And similarly, at the end of the day, you expect to see a summary of everything that's happened. All this has come about by virtue of being able to record on tape and replay and to split screens and use all the gizmo that exists in an age of technology where a golf tournament isn't a golf tournament anymore, either nationally or internationally, without television.
In 1965, a drought in Queensland forced the Australian Golf Union to switch the venue of the Open Championship from Royal Queensland Golf Club to Adelaide's Kooyonga Club. It was to be the 4th time Kooyonga had hosted the Open. The first time was in 1950, when Norman von Nyder won his first Australian Open with a score of 286, while in 1954, Aussie Pickworth captured his 4th title with a total of 280. And in 1958, Gary Player won for the first time with 271, 7 shots better than any previous score in the championship. In 1965, Kooyonga had just 6 short weeks' notice that it would stage the championship once again. And it was no fault of the club that its course turned out to be defenceless when Player, Jack Nicklaus and the cream of our own amateurs and professionals teed off. The weather for the 4 days was sublime, still and calm, and Kooyonga was savaged by the world-class field. Player shot 62 in the first round, going out in 28 and home in 34. But after a second round 70, found himself 4 shots behind Nicklaus, who opened with 66-63. What an extraordinary tournament. In those days, the final 36 holes were played on the final Saturday, and on the morning of the final day, Player charged to yet another 62 and received a slow play warning on the way. It upset him, and he explained to the tournament committee that if the fairways and greens had been roped off, as they were for major tournaments in other parts of the world, he could have cut down his playing time. His winning total of 264 was 28 under Kooyonga's standard scratch score and remains the championship record.
When I set the Australian Open record, which I hope is going to last for a long time to come, was in Adelaide at Kooyonga. And I started off the first day, and Jack Nicklaus was rooming next door to me, and I shot 62 the first day, and he shot 66. And going back in the car that night, he said to me, "How can a little sawn-off runt like you shoot 62, and I shoot 66, and I'm 4 shots back?" He says, "But I'm going to catch you." I said, "Well, we'll see what happens about that." The next day, I went out and shot 70, which is always a very respectable round, and Jack Nicklaus shot 63. So that night going back, I said, "Jack, you know, I don't know how a big piece of blubber like you can shoot 63 on the golf course, and here I've shot 62, 70, 132, which is an average of 66s, and I'm 3 behind you now." But I said, "I'm going to catch you tomorrow." And I went out the next day, and I missed a 3-footer on the 9th hole to be out in 29. I shot 30, and then I birdied the next 2, so I was actually about 10 under after 10 holes, or 11 holes, and Jack Nicklaus sent his caddy along and said, "Go and find out how Gary's doing." And I said, "Well, you can tell Jack that I'm 10 under. He says, "No, not for the tournament, I mean for today." I said, "I'm 10 under. And Jack shouted from the other fairway, he says, "You're a big liar, you're not 10 under. I said, "Yes, I am." And I went on to win, and it was a strange feeling to shoot 2 62s in one tournament. That is, well, you know, if you play golf, you can understand that that is something that just happens. You can't plan on that. A little sequel to the story of Kooyonga. Being so excited, I wore red pants that day and a white shirt, and I had a lovely white jacket and white shoes, and I was standing in the airport, and I'll never forget this. I was so proud of this Australian Open record, 262s, and this little lady came up to me and she said, "Excuse me, sir, are you the bus driver? Do you take us downtown? If not, where can I buy the tickets?" I said, "The tickets are on me."
Soon after Player's 1965 triumph, the Royal and Ancient announced that the 1966 British Open would be played over 4 days for the first time. Australia's top players pleaded for the Australian Golf Union to follow the St Andrews lead. And when Arnold Palmer won at Royal Queensland in 1966, it was a 4-day event. The automatic draw for the final 2 days' play followed soon after.
Tournament leader by 7 strokes after 3 rounds is Arnold Palmer of the United States, who has yet to win an Australian Open. Palmer misses a birdie at the first. On the 8th fairway, Kel Nagel continues to play sound golf, but has little chance of overtaking Palmer's lead. This approach shot is good. Palmer reveals his class with this recovery to within 2 feet of the pin. An easy birdie to Palmer, and again he leads by 7 strokes. Now the 18th green, where Bruce Devlin finishes with a par 4 for a total of 285 and equal 4th place. Beginning the 18th, Peter Thompson was a stroke behind Devlin, but finishes with an excellent birdie to share 4th place with Devlin. The 18th is also birdied by Roberto Di Vincenzo, who takes 3rd place. His total, 284. Another birdie at the 18th is scored by Kel Nagel, who is the runner-up with a total of 281. Western Australian Len Thomas shares 6th place with Alan Murray on 287. On the green for 2, Arnold Palmer has the title won. He misses with his second putt and finishes the tournament with a bogey 5, but wins his first Australian Open by 5 strokes with a 20 under par 276.
The Honourable Michael Scott was not to know the great names that would follow in his footsteps when he won the first Australian Open Championship over the Australian Golf Club's original botany layout way back in 1904. Scott, the son of the Earl of Eldon, was 26 years old when he took the inaugural championship from a field of 46 players from Scotland, New Zealand, England and Australia. His score of 315 over 72 holes played on 2 successive days gave him an 8-stroke win over fellow amateur H.L. Hyland. He was described as a pocket Hercules by one Sydney golf correspondent because of the great distances he could hit the ball. Scott went on to win a second Open Championship in 1907, but this second victory was marred by bitter controversy. Runner-up Dan Souter protested to the Royal Melbourne Committee in charge of the event that Scott should have been disqualified for hitting off outside the teeing ground at the 12th hole. But the protest was dismissed amidst great feeling of revulsion from Souter's supporters. A further protest was made to the Royal and Ancient Golf Club of St Andrews, which ruled that Souter should have been awarded the title and the Honourable Michael Scott disqualified. However, Royal Melbourne stood by its original decision and refused to alter the result. Souter was one of many young Scots to migrate to Australia from the township of Carnoustie, and he turned professional after winning the Australian Amateur Championship of 1903 and finishing 3rd behind Scott in the inaugural Open Championship a year later. He won the 1905 Open as a professional, and many historians claim he was the rightful winner again in 1907. The Australian Open was not a happy tournament for Souter. He was runner-up 7 times, 5 of them in successive years from 1906. His winning total of 337 in 1905 is the highest score ever to win the title. Souter had a huge influence on early Australian golf. Perhaps Souter's greatest monument in golf is the world-renowned Kingston Heath course, which he designed in the mid-20s, and which ranks as one of this country's great championship layouts. Souter was a close friend of fellow Scot Carnegie Clark, another pioneer of the game in this country. Clark arrived in Australia in 1902 and won the Open Championship 3 times, in 1906, 10 and 11, and was runner-up to Royal Melbourne amateur Alec Russell in 1924. Clark was one of the driving forces behind the establishment of the Australian PGA and designed many courses, including Royal Queensland and Royal Sydney's original layout. But as the first decade of the 20th century ticked by, there emerged a man who must be recognised as Australian golf's first superstar. Ivo Harrington Whitten took up golf when his cricketing ambitions went unrewarded at Melbourne Grammar School. When his father tossed him an old brassy to keep the boy amused, he little realised the force he was unleashing onto the fledgling Australian golf scene. Whitten was to become a giant in the game, winning the Australian Open 5 times in 1912, 1913, 1926, 1929, and finally, at the age of 37, in 1931. When Whitten won his 5th and final Open 19 years later, the emerging talents of the young Jim Ferrier and the freakish Victorian left-hander Harry Williams had already caught the eye of contemporary critics. Again, the weather was foul, with rain and wind lashing the exposed Kensington layout. Whitten started the final round 5 shots behind teenager Harry Williams, but went out in 33 for a 73, and his total of 301 downed Ferrier by a shot. He was branded the greatest ever Australian golfer, and but for the intervention of World War I, who knows how many Australian Open titles Ivo Whitten would have won. Although Whitten dominated nearly 3 decades of Australian golf, he also won 2 amateur championships. Other great players also enjoyed success. When Joe Kirkwood won his Open Championship in 1920, he had 7 clubs in his bag and slashed a massive 12 shots from the previous tournament record with a winning score of 290 at Kensington. He was the first man to break 300 for the 72 holes of the title. But Kirkwood was to be lost to Australian golf. He pursued a career in America as a trick shot player and travelled the world with the great Walter Hagen, giving trick shot exhibitions and straight exhibitions alongside Hagen. It will be as a trick shot player that Kirkwood will always be remembered. Kirkwood started the Roaring 20s with his 1920 win, but it was a decade that gave Ivo Witten 2 of his 5 victories. The only other amateur to win in the 20s was Witten's Royal Melbourne clubmate Alec Russell. Russell scored 303 at Royal Melbourne in 1924. Arthur Lefebvre, Royal Melbourne's professional for many years, won in 1921. Charlie Campbell a year later, and Tommy Howard was smoking his pipe when he became Australian Open champion in 1923. Fred Popplewell's 2 wins were in the 20s. His first was in 1925, and in 1928 he holed in one in the last round. He downed Rufus Stewart by a shot at Royal Adelaide in 1928. Gene Sarazen was the first world-rated American to play in our Open. In 1934 he came to Royal Sydney but went home chastened and empty-handed, beaten by local pro Billy Bolger in a tournament everybody, including Sarazen, thought he would win. Bolger's winning total of 283 left all other Open records in tatters. It was 7 shots better than Kirkwood's score in 1920. The humbled Sarazen vowed he would return and win the Open. 2 years later, he was as good as his word and took the title at Metropolitan, shaving a shot off Bolger's record. Runner-up to Sarazen that year was Victorian left-handed amateur Harry Williams, who Sarazen described as the best left-handed player in the world. Williams shot 286 at Metropolitan, the lowest ever by an amateur. Sarazen told him to turn professional and go to America, where he would make his fortune. Williams rejected the offer. In one of golf's great ironies, Williams committed suicide in 1961, penniless. Bruce Devlin was the last player to win the title as an amateur. He subsequently turned professional. But the last amateur to win the Australian Open and remain an amateur was MJ Mick Ryan. Ryan was a VFL footballer and played for South Melbourne before turning to golf. He was a member of Kingston Heath when he led the field home at Royal Adelaide in 1932. The driver he used still hangs in the bar at Kingston Heath. Lou Kelly was a dogged and talented golfer, and the combination of those attributes brought him Open glory in 1933 at Royal Melbourne. Victorian George Naismith had one of the shortest backswings in golf. He was yesterday's Ted Ball. In 1937 at the Australian, he battled through vicious sandstorms for a total of 299 and went back on the course to see his pursuers falter one by one. The sand whipped up by the wind forced the players to protect their skins with umbrellas, and at several holes the sand was so thick on the greens, workmen were recruited to scrape it away so the players could putt. It was the same George Naismith who trained Peter Thompson and David Graham in his Riversdale Pro Shop. World War II was just around the corner when big Jim Ferrier won his 2 Open championships in 1938 and 39. His first victory was at Royal Adelaide with Norman von Neider in 2nd place. And at Royal Melbourne the following year, Ferrier repeated with von Neider sharing 2nd place with Martin Smith.
In 1938 and 39, you were runner-up to Jim Ferrier, Norman, and in 1939 there was a story about a putter you were using in that Open Championship.
Well, yes, Don, like, as you know, all golfers are superstitious, and when you're putting, confidence is 99% of the actual sort of fact of being able to hold the putt. And with this putter, I felt comfortable. But on this particular day, I lost my confidence with it, and rather than sort of have it in my bag again for the next day, I thought, well, if I hold it in the bag, I'll probably use it. So instead of sort of being in a position where I could use it, I broke the shaft in the locker room. I took the club into the locker room, and I broke it in there. And for some reason or other, a steward took it upon himself to tell the press that Von Neider had broken his putter in anger. But it wasn't in anger at all. It was just that it was a simple fact that I didn't want to use it the next day because I'd lost my confidence with it.
You played in the Open for many years before you won it. Were you ever despairing that you would ever win it?
No, I knew that my time would come, but in 1938 and 39, I was playing each of the last 2 rounds with Jim Ferrier, and he's the best putter, I think, that ever lived or ever will live, because his average putting on those the two final rounds, the one in Royal Adelaide and the one at Royal Melbourne, I think Royal Adelaide was 21 putts, and in Royal Melbourne I think it was 19 putts, and that's impossible. Nobody else has ever been able to do that ever.
In 1939, America's great woman athlete turned pro golfer, Babe Diedrichson, had her entry for the Open rejected. In those 2 years, Ferrier also won the Australian Amateur Championship and earned the nickname of the Undertaker for the way he buried his opponents. Ferrier went to America in 1940 and turned professional when he was barred from playing in the US Amateur Championship because of a golf instruction book he had written. He became an American citizen. He served in the US Army during the war, and in 1947 became the first Australian to win an American major title with victory in the US PGA Championship. Cometh the hour, cometh the man. When World War II finished in 1945, Australian golf came out of its 6-year hiatus, looking for the way ahead. And out of the Army came Horace Henry Alfred Pickworth, Aussie Pickworth, one of the most popular and flamboyant characters the Australian game has ever known. His skill matched his flamboyance. Aussie chain-smoked and wisecracked his way into the record books by winning the first 3 post-war Australian Opens at Royal Sydney, Royal Queensland and Kingston Heath. He was the first, and still is the only player ever to win the old championship 3 times in a row. And he added a 4th to his record when he won again at Kooyonga in 1954. But it was his 1948 triumph that stamped Pickworth as a real champion. His boyhood adversary Jim Ferrier was back in Australia as the US PGA champion to win the Australian Open for a 3rd time. It was to be routine, or so he thought. There was never any love lost between the 2 men. They had both cut their golf teeth at Manly Golf Club, where Ferrier was the privileged son of the club's secretary-manager and Pickworth the boy in the pro shop. As Ferrier said when he arrived at Kingston Heath, "Nobody in America will take much notice if I win the Australian Open, but they'll be surprised if I don't." Well, he didn't. Peter Thomson played his first Australian Open in the dramatic Pickworth-Ferrier playoff year of 1948 and led home the amateur field. 2 years later, he turned professional, and at Metropolitan in 1951, just 21 years of age, Thomson won the first of his 3 Australian Opens, with Von Neider in 2nd place. But it was the manner of his victory that stamped Thomson as mature beyond his years. His score of 283 equalled the best return ever by an Australian, matching Billy Bolger's 1934 total and Ferrier's 1938 score.
Norman, you had a big influence on Peter Thomson's early career. Can you explain just how that influence was exerted and where you first met Peter?
Yes, well, an amateur by the name of Harry Young, who was, I believe, an enormous influence on the fact that Peter Thomson became, in my opinion, the best player Australia's ever had. He rang me and he said that there was a young fellow in Victoria named Peter Thomson that he would like to have me look at him, and suggested that if he brought him up to Sydney, I might play with him. And I said, well, bring him up and we'll arrange for him to play in the McWilliams Wines. And I played with him, and fortunately I won the tournament. I played with Peter in the actual tournament, and at the presentation of prizes after the tournament, I made the statement then publicly that I thought Peter Thomson would become the best player Australia ever had.
Thomson's 1951 Open victory brought him to the threshold of a career unmatched by any Australian golfer before or since. He became the first Australian to win a British Open in 1954 and became the first player in modern history to win 3 in succession, adding the 1955 and 56 British titles to his record. 5 times he was British Open champion, just 1 short of the great Harry Varden's all-time total.
the winning of your first Australian Open Championship mean to you? Was it the start of your great career in golf or not?
Well, it was a large step up the ladder because it was one of my aims as a young man. I aimed, well, I want to be champion of Australia and then Britain and then the world, and after that the universe. But when I won that Open in 51, it really gave me tremendous confidence that I could win big things.
Adelaide's Kooyonga was the host club for the first time when Norman von Nyder finally broke through for his first Australian Open title. 2 years later, around Perth Lake Carrinyup, von Nyder posted a tournament record when he scored 278 and became the first man to break through the 280 barrier. He repeated that score around Royal Melbourne's East Course the following year, shooting a superb 65 in the final round.
But for me, the great memory was Norman von Nyder, who I regarded as Australia's greatest pound for pound or kilo for kilo, whatever it is these days, sportsman. He won three, I think, Australian Opens, but he won in 1953 at Royal Melbourne, and I walked every inch of the way. I was writing his stories with him at the time for the Telegraph, and he shot 65 in the closing round. It was the bravest and most authoritative round of golf that I've ever seen in an Australian Open Championship.
Can you tell us a little about that, why it was so brave? Was he being pressed, or...?
He was being pressed. There was a very good field for the time. There was Pickworth and Peter Thompson, and Peter Thompson really took the lead at one stage, but the Von came back at him, and he just ground them all down. He was absolutely relentless. He hit the fairways, he rifled these iron shots into the green, and he holed some magnificent putts. Norman always said that he wasn't a good putter, but on this day, I tell you what, it was a magnificent putting display. It was a memorable display, because Royal Melbourne was an absolute tiger of a course. It was a grey day, if I remember rightly, a fair bit of wind. He had that little black beret on that that used to highlight his appearance on the course, and he was relentless. And he was such a small man, 9 stone, wringing wet, but he had these iron hands as a boy, and he really did it tough. He worked in the abattoirs, and his job was to split open the heads of the sheep that had been slaughtered. And of course, he said that his hands were just steel after all this, and although he was a small man, he was very, very strong. But that was my greatest memory of an Open. Norman von Nyder, 1953, Royal Melbourne, the closing round 65. It's the best I've ever seen.
Perhaps 1955 was the most controversial Australian Open ever played. South Africa's great Bobby Locke came and conquered at Brisbane's Gales Golf Club, but could not have left with a very good impression.
Open Championship at Gales in Queensland was quite extraordinary, but not for the same reasons. Bobby Locke was brought out by the Australian Golf Union that year, and he eventually won it. But in winning it, he had to survive some of the worst conditions I've ever seen at a golf tournament. It absolutely teemed on the first day, and play should have been called off. Players were actually chasing their balls down the fairway. The torrent of water picked the balls up, and they went down the fairway, and players were backing off, waiting for the balls to stop so they could hit them. Levee banks were built around greens to try and keep the tournament going, and the golf course itself at Gales was built by the inmates of an asylum next door, and the golf course went around the asylum. And when the wind blew in the wrong direction, the noise from the asylum was quite frightening. And also, at several holes, the inmates of the asylum could and did cling to the barbed wire tops of the paling fences and talk to the players. And the conversations were very unusual, to say the least.
Bobby was coming down the 18th, and I was going up the 10th. And Bobby said it was the worst storm he'd ever played in. And I still had 8 holes to go. Well, along near the asylum at Gales, they've got the asylum there, we had to wade through water. I'm not kidding, it was a foot deep on the fairway, across the gullies. And all the greens were flooded, covered with water. And I chipped with a 7-iron.
On the greens?
On the greens, the last 6, 7, 8 holes. And you know, really today you wouldn't do that, because the officials would call it off, everyone would be back in the clubhouse, and you'd go out next day. But that was one that Norman von Nyder and myself, we tied for second. Bobby won the tournament.
The inmates of an asylum were actually watching the golf from over the fences.
Yes, and when we got to the, I think it was the 12th or 13th tee, they're lined up alongside the fence and it's pouring down rain, and one of the fellas said, just as I was about to get off, I don't know what's wrong with you fellas, but we're supposed to be a bit, you know, around the twist, but we feel here that you people are around the twist playing golf in sort of weather like this.
Although Locke said he would be back to defend the following year, he did not appear at Royal Sydney, where the fresh-faced Bruce Crampton swept to victory with birdies at the final 2 holes to edge out Kel Nagle. Crampton went to make his career in America, returning home occasionally to play in Australia. In 1971, he was runner-up to Jack Nicklaus at Royal Hobart.
The year after you won the Australian Open, you won, of course, the great centenary British Open. Would you class that as your greatest victory ever?
Yes, yeah, it would be. Yeah, the greatest.
You played with a hand injury, did you not?
Well, when I got there, Peter and I had played at Port Marnock in the World Cup, Canada Cup. We finished 3rd, I think. And I was driving the ball good and playing good. And then all of a sudden, I got tendonitis in the little finger. And I would wake up in the morning and my little finger would be sort of bent like that. And I'd put it in hot water and cold water and gradually get it to work. And then I'd go down and, you know, I'd hit a couple of short shots, 4-iron shots, didn't hit a drive at all. And went up and had a few putts, and that was my practice. Well, after I won the Open, I didn't play for about 3 months. I came home and I was having treatment and finished up Dr. Webb. He said, look, I haven't got much faith in this, but he said, I'm going to give you a cortisone injection. And he put that big needle down through in there, and in 3 days I was out playing, and I went across to Perth, and that's when Bruce Devlin won the Open in Perth. I think I finished pretty well up. I played with him the last round, but that was my first tournament. But, you know, it was just one of those things, and you'd swing the club back, and you'd only get back a certain way, and your hand would almost come off. The pain was fantastic.
Frank Phillips scored his second win when Melbourne's Victoria Golf Club was invited to stage its first Open in 1961. But the next 2 years belonged to Gary Player. Player's second and third championships came at Royal Adelaide and Royal Melbourne. The Gary Player-Jack Nicklaus show got into full swing the next year when the Golden Bear was lucky to make a tie with Bruce Devlin at the Lakes. Devlin needed only a par 5 to win, but his pitch to the last green ran back to him to lift Nicklaus into the playoff, which the American won the following day.
Bruce Devlin had this putt to win the 1964 Open Championship. His reaction says it all.
From Player's first Open victory in 1958 to Nicklaus's final Open title in 1978, the two players dominated the title, winning 13 times between them. Add victories to Americans Arnold Palmer and J.C. Snead, both at Royal Queensland in 1966 and 1973, and 15 times in 21 years the Open went overseas. It was a lean time for Australian golf, as foreign players plundered the Australian scene. Our Open champions in that period were thin on the ground, and in one stretch of 10 titles between 1962 and 1971, Peter Thomson was the only Australian to succeed. Otherwise, it was all Player and Nicklaus, with Arnold Palmer chipping in to break the routine with his 1966 triumph. At Royal Sydney in 1969, the Open was sponsored for the first time. The international air carrier Qantas had the naming rights. A top-class field of internationals, including Lee Trevino, Tony Jacklin and Gary Player, were after the old trophy against the best of Australia's top players. Peter Thomson was in the field. A wild windstorm hit the tournament on the final day. In the end, it came down to Gary Player and Guy Wolstenholme, and when Player triumphed for the 5th time, he equalled the record of the great Ivo Witten. This unique picture taken in England in 1913 shows Ivo Whitten with the great Harry Varden on the left, Ted Ray and J. Douglas Edgar. They played an exhibition together.
There was a memorable occasion at Royal Sydney when you were playing the last hole around the corner, and the announcer over the audio said, "Gary Player, you were 40 yards short of the green or something, needs two to get down and two to win the Open."
Yes.
And you argued with him. You said no, you had three, and you were totally baffled by how many shots that were required.
Well, that was such a bad storm. I can still remember seeing, in fact, they had these beautiful Australian girls standing on the edge of the tee, and it was raining, and they were just standing out and getting all wet, and nobody left the course. They were great supporters, and it poured, and as you know, the wind came up, and I got a little confused, and I thought I needed a 5 on the last hole to win. Well, what a terrible feeling when you're getting ready to play, and the announcer says, well, he says, ladies and gentlemen, he needs to get down in 2 to win. I said, no, I need 3 to get down. He said, no, you need 2. I said, you sure it's not 3? He says, no, it's 2. Well, I chipped it up about 8 foot away and nearly missed it.
The week prior to his final Open win around Perth's Lake Carrinyup in 1974, Gary Player had been the target of the worst demonstrations ever seen in Australian golf when he competed in the Wills Masters at the Australian. Police arrested scores of people. Further demonstrations were threatened in Perth the following week, but delicate negotiations with the would-be anti-apartheid groups diffused the situation. And some of the people who had planned to demonstrate even went to Lake Carrinyup to watch the Open peacefully. Player took the title for the 7th time with a score of 277. David Graham had plenty of talent stacked against him when his year came at the Australian in 1977. Jack Nicklaus, Ray Floyd and Hubert Green were just some of the big names from the US Tour. But Graham fulfilled a lifetime ambition by capturing the championship with a score of 284. He went on to win the US PGA Championship in 1979. 2 years later, he became the first Australian to win the US Open. Jack Newton's long search for an Australian Open title finally climaxed at Metropolitan in 1979, when he defeated Greg Norman and Graham Marsh. According to Jack, he played a lot of rubbish in his final round 72, holing from off the green 3 times. But it was not a matter of how, but how many. And at the finish, the popular Newton was a shot clear of the field. Norman had a chance to force a playoff, but missed from 4 feet on the final green.
A special part of your great career in golf?
Certainly was. I think any time you win your own country's Open, I think is particularly exciting, and I'd won big tournaments all over the world and never won the Australian Open, and being a very proud Australian that I was, and I think I tried my best to carry the Australian banner wherever I went. It certainly was for me a very proud moment, and especially with my father caddying for me, and it was a good field on a great golf course, so for me it was certainly the highlight of my career.
Do you remember the last half dozen holes? It was a very strong finish, as I recall.
Yeah, it was a great championship in many respects, because I think a lot of players had a good chance to win. I had been in front and then had a minor disaster on the 7th hole, I remember, where I took a double bogey. And then again, I made another double bogey at the 15th, which really threw the tournament wide open, because Bob Shearer, I think from memory, had made 5 birdies in a row. Norman, who was playing in the last group, was making a bit of a charge. And Gary Player and Graham Marsh, who I was playing with, were also in there with a chance. And I chipped in actually at the 16th to get 1 in front. And I remember putting my, the 15th, and then I put my second shot in the bunker at the 16th over the back, and had probably one of the most difficult trap shots you can get. And I was playing with Player, and I remember hitting, well, it was just a dream shot. I had about 6 inches to pitch the ball in out of the bunker, and landed it right on the spot, and the ball trickled down to within about 6 inches of the hole. And Gary said to me, that's one of the best bunker shots I've ever seen, and that made me quite proud. And then I parred the last 2 holes. Norman needed 4 in the end to tie, and 3 putt at the last. That particular week, The US Masters champion was in the field in Hubert Green. The British Open champion was in the field in Ballesteros. And Fuzzy Zeller was in the field as the PGA champion. So it was a very strong field, quite apart from our own players. And I think any win is really qualified by the type of golf course, the score you shoot, and who the opposition is. So that was why, for me, the Australian Open at Metro meant so much.
4 years after his Australian Open triumph, Newton's competitive fire was tragically lost to golf. He lost an arm and an eye, and very nearly his life, in an horrific accident at Sydney Airport. It was Greg Norman's year, the first of the 3 Open Championships he has won. Norman watched from the back of the last green as Japan-based Brian Jones searched in vain for the birdie that would force a playoff. But Norman, it erased the bitter memories of Metropolitan just a year earlier.
How significant to you was winning your first Australian Open?
Oh, it means a lot. I think any national open, especially your home nation, it's a lot of pride involved. You know, irrespective of whether you're playing for $10 or $1 million, I think being the Australian Open and being as patriot Australian as what I am, you know, I wanted to win it. I wanted to win it with a passion. I'll never forget oh, that was bad luck, wasn't it? I'll never forget when Jack Newton, I 3-putted the last green at Metropolitan and Jack won it. You know, it was like, oh, I let my chance go. And then the next year, I think, was at the Lace Golf Club, and I beat Brian Jones by a shot.
Norman's 2 other titles were both won at Royal Melbourne, both of them in controversial circumstances. In 1985, poor weather forced the abandonment of a day's play, and for the first time, the championship was cut to 54 holes.
Australian Open Championship, the 1985.
2 years later, at Royal Melbourne again, a vicious northerly wind combined with an incorrect pin placement on the 3rd hole made the green impossible to putt on, which forced the AGU to postpone the day's play. In unprecedented scenes, paying customers were given their money back. The players returned to a more docile course the next day, and Norman won by 10 shots from Lyle.
When I won it around Royal Melbourne, that to me it would be like winning the British Open around St Andrews. I love the golf course at St Andrews. I love Royal Melbourne, my favourite golf course in the world. So I've had a lot of fond memories of the Australian Open. I've come second a few times. I won it a few times. You know, I'd like to beat Nicklaus's record or Gary Player's record of a number of Australian Opens. So if you're a very proud and patriotic person and love your country, there's nothing better than winning a national Open.
Norman's 2 victories at Royal Melbourne was split by Roger Davis's Metropolitan win in 1986.
Playing with Graham Marsh, who at the time I thought looked like to be the winner, even though he is equal with Ian Baker Finch. But he did a very good shot into 16. I thought I'd hold my putt at 16, but it missed, and Marsh missed about an 8-footer. So I got onto 17th tee, and that's where I thought I took the gamble and it paid off. There's a bunker down the left-hand side. The pin was cut on the right-hand side of the green. So if I took the bunker on, I could go in with a shorter iron because you hit a downslope. And I caught the drive just perfect. And it gave me the shot from just on the left-hand side of the fairway with a 5-iron. I hit that to a foot. And the last 3 holes, especially at Metro, into the wind, which they nearly always play, are 3 very tough holes. And I think that birdie really set everything up for me.
Davis was on the comeback trail, returning to tournament golf after a business failure cost him most of his life savings.
You know, I went into a venture like a lot of other people try to do, and of course it failed and I lost everything. And came back in 1984 and I went to the UK and I spent 5 months over there without my wife, all my children. You know, I just had to do it. We couldn't afford to fly them over. But luckily enough, I played well enough and they don't have to go through that again.
Bill Rogers, the pencil slim and very popular American who had surprised a lot of people by winning the British Open in 1981, came to Australia for our Open later in the year. Rogers was on a roll and around Victoria Golf Club's testing layout blocked Greg Norman's bid for a 2nd straight title with a score of 282.
Let's put the
weight right on him to try and emulate that shot of Nicklaus. Beautiful swing.
Like most golfers, Bob Shearer is a sportsman to his fingertips. His Open victory around the Australian in '82 was one of the most popular in modern-day golf. Shearer called a two-shot penalty on himself in the first round for grounding his club in a bunker at the short 15th. With Americans Jack Nicklaus and Payne Stewart sharing second place behind him, the victory was all the sweeter.
I could just about remember every shot for the 4 days, Graham, but probably starting off would be the penalty shot I had at the 15th, playing with Jack Nicklaus the first day, hitting the shot out of the bunker, and I thought it was out of the bunker, and I gave the sand a bit of a dust up there, and to my amazement, when I walked over the hill, the ball dropped back into the bunker, and I guess Jack was on my side that I shouldn't have got to, but it was just a personal thought that I would have felt like a cheat if I'd have gone out the next day without the two-shot penalty, so I took that. And I think after that, the third hole, I think it was on the third day, holding an 8-iron shot straight into the hole on the fly. And then possibly, you know, obviously the last day I can remember every shot playing with Jack. And long putt at the 13th hole, I'd hit the ball close to the hole for about 5 holes in a row. You know, or not close, but 10, 12 feet away, and testing putts, and hadn't made one. And then all of a sudden, hold one from 40 feet at the 13th hole up over the hump they used to have in that green. And from then on, then of course the next hole, a couple of fellas fell out of a tree on the backswing, on my backswing, and with my second shot at the 14th hole, and I carved it way into the pine trees on the right, chipped it out onto the fairway, and happened to hold that shot before, which I think by that stage put me about 4 or 5 in front of Jack. And as I was repairing the divot, Jack walked past me, and he said, "You're not even playing the game fair now." But and then obviously the last shot I hit to the last green, the 3-iron shot, after Jack had hit a shot onto the green, my caddy and a few other people standing around wanted me to lay up and pitch onto the green, and I could foresee all sorts of things going wrong if I laid up and then put a couple in the water. So I thought, give me the 3-iron and bang it on the green and finish, you know, hopefully a grandstand type of finish. But that probably was the best shot I hit all week, the second shot there and onto the green, and that was the Australian Open, and it was obviously, to this stage, it's still my greatest thrill.
It was against the backdrop of the Australians' fire-gutted clubhouse that Shearer won his Australian Open. A new $6 million clubhouse has replaced the old one. Two of Australia's emerging stars fought out the finish of the 1983 title at Kingston Heath, and it was Peter Fowler who emerged with the crown. In a nail-biting finish, he prevailed over Ian Baker Finch with a winning total of 285, just 3 under par. The victory changed Fowler's life.
Well, it meant a lot because it just got me onto the road of success, and that was my first tournament victory as such, and it gave me a good start, and people started to recognise me, and I started to feature a little bit more overseas then.
5 British Opens, US Masters titles and US Open crowns make Tom Watson one of the greats of golf. And in 1984, his name was added to the list of champions who have won our Australian Open. There was no better credentialed player in the field than Watson when he scored 281, 7 under par around Royal Melbourne's composite course to down the surprise runner-up, Bob Stanton. A little secret, Watson is a non-smoker, but will choose tobacco.
Australian Open Championship.
To pitch this up over the slope, will play a chip and run. Looks like he's got the lofted club in hand.
Hey, look out.
Oh, Eagle 3.
Do you mind?
He came to Royal Sydney in 1988 and blitzed a top-class field with the second lowest score ever returned in the title. Calcavecchia posted a winning total of 269, or 19 under par, over the revamped Royal Sydney layout. It was sensational scoring. Queensland's Peter Senior took charge of the 1989 Australian Open early in the tournament, and for the first time in the title, we had a winner with a broomstick putter. The putter with the extra long shaft came to Senior's chin, but he wielded it with deadly effect at Kingston Heath to win by 7 shots from Peter Fowler. Throughout his career, Senior has been vulnerable to the yips and got the idea of using the broomstick from Scottish professional Sam Torrance. That it worked was indicated by Senior's winning total of a 17 under par, 271.
Australian Open champion.
For more thoughts on the Australian Open, let's talk again to the Golden Bear.
Well,
over that period.
I'm a lot older, that's for sure. I think we all are. I certainly play the game entirely differently than I used to play it. I used to play the game by overpowering golf courses, using my head, still using my head, but overpowering it with my head too. And now I can't overpower it with my golf swing, so I have to use my head, play around hazards I used to play over. I have to think a little bit more, try to avoid in the rough a little bit more, because the rough was not really a factor for me. If I hit it in the rough, I usually only played a wedge to the green anyway. Now if I hit it in the rough, I've got a 5-iron to the green. And it's a little bit different game for me, but my golf clubs are basically the same though. They really haven't changed. Matter of fact, I still have the same 3-wood in my bag since 1958. So they've had there for 31 years.
I'm told that you gave the name the Golden Bear to Jack Nicklaus. Is that true?
Yeah, that's absolutely true.
Can you tell us how that came about?
Well, it happened in Melbourne in the early 1960s when Mark McCormick brought Jack Nicklaus to Australia for the first time, and at that stage Jack Nicklaus was crew cut, had huge thighs, and laboured really under the nicknames of Blubber Whale and Ohio Fats, which weren't very complimentary. At any rate, Mark McCormick asked me what did I think of this young man that he brought out from America, and I said, well, I think he looks like a big cuddly golden bear. Now the cuddly part of it, you have to ask his wife about it, but the golden bear part stuck. And it was many years actually before Jack publicly acknowledged it, and he acknowledged it in an interview in Sports Illustrated, American Sports Illustrated. And I've still got that cutting at home because I've had a lot of fun and no financial return out of naming Jack the Golden Bear, but he has acknowledged it.
Can you go into the aspect of working on your mind a little deeper?
Well, I think what one has got to be able to do, Tom, one has got to be able to suffer, and you've got to be able to teach yourself to enjoy suffering. Because whoever you are in this world, doesn't matter how much money is not the thing that prevents it. Whatever your position in life is, you're going to encounter adversity. And adversity is what makes a man. If you can really, and when you're winning major championships, when you're winning the US Open or the British Open or the Masters, you're going to encounter adversity. And you're going to have difficulties to encounter. So you've got to work on that. You've got to teach yourself patience. You've got to teach yourself, as I say, to enjoy suffering. It's not very easy. And the mind is something you can talk about for a year. There should be books. Golf, theory-wise, is nothing really new. Golf clubs have become, in my mind, almost illegal, and golf balls are going so much further. But I must say that the mind is something that they haven't scratched the surface of. You know, when the Russians had the weightlifting competitions and the rest of the world there, and the Russians cannot lift the weight eventually, they say, gee, but I'm weak. The other people say, gee, but the weights are heavy. Now, there's a little psychology in that and a little message in that.
The ambition started in 1969 when I won the Australian Amateur, and I guess looking down the record books, I saw there was only 6 other people, I believe, that had ever won the Open and the Amateur. And so I believe at this stage, I have to check the record books, but I believe that I was the 7th person to have won the Amateur and then the Open as a professional.
The support that Nicklaus, a player, came down, I think they win about 12 tournaments between the two of them, maybe 13 Australian Opens, so they basically had a monopoly on it. And the other thing too, I think they enjoyed playing the small ball back in those days. I think they were allowed to at the Australian Open, and Jack used to tell me stories about the small ball and where he used to hit it at Metropolitan and stuff like that. And
the distance.
Yeah, prodigious distances. You know, I know the 9th hole at Metropolitan, for example, he used to drive it over the trees with a 3-wood. At that time, I said, well, Jack, that was 20 years ago. The trees are 20 years shorter too. So,
you recall that Saracen was impressed with Williams, and
yes,
so were you.
Saracen was very impressed with him, as was I, at that particular time. Harry Williams, Jim Ferrier and myself, we were, I think, the same age. And of the 3 players, of Williams, myself and Harry, I would say that Harry Williams was the best player of the 3 of us. And Gene Saracen after, I think he played with Harry Williams in one particular round, and he offered him $100,000 to turn pro. And I feel sure that Harry Williams possibly may have been alive today if he'd have accepted that and turned pro, because I'm positive he would have been a marvellous sort of professional.
For several years, the Australian Golf Union has gathered golf memorabilia for its Melbourne Museum. So let's go on a short tour with former British amateur champion Doug Backley.
A lot of the players that we've been talking about, we've got clubs used by Jack Nicklaus here in winning an Open. We've got some clubs that Ozzie Pickworth used in winning an Open. Moving along, we have Von Ryder's putter, which he created a record score of 65 in winning the British Masters Championship on his first tour to England. Also, we have Kelnagel's sand iron, which he used in winning the Centenary British Open Championship at St Andrews. And also 2 famous old clubs used by Billy Bolger in winning the 1934 Australian Open. We'd like now to show you our museum piece, and that is the set of golf clubs used by L.A. White in winning the Australian Amateur Championship at Geelong Golf Club in 1894.
How did the name Great White Shark come about?
That originated in 1981 at the US Masters. At that time I was leading the tournament, I think, or one shot behind the lead on Friday. It was my first Masters I'd ever played in. And obviously I had to go in the press room, and, you know, most of the guys who do major championships aren't, a lot of them are regular reporters, but a lot of them aren't. So everybody wants to catch up, who's this guy, what's he done, you know, go through his history. And obviously they want to know what your hobby is, and I told them I enjoyed fishing, and I caught a few sharks in my day, and obviously with my white hair and leading the tournament at that time, I think it was, everything just gelled together, and one guy called me the Great White Shark, and that was it. And it sort of stuck ever since then, and it's not too bad.
I take great pride in the fact that I look after my body, because that's the best investment one makes in their lives. And if I can give young people, it's too late to talk to old people, but if you can talk to young people and get a message, look after your body. It's something that you'll cherish and you'll appreciate it as you get older. And I think one of the reasons that I've won so many championships, which is almost 150 tournaments all over the world, is because I have looked after my body, and it's enabled me to, you know, handle this time change, severe time change. I've traveled more than any athlete that has ever lived, 7 million miles, and in those days we didn't have jets and Concords like today. Today you leave London and you arrive in New York before you leave. But I have looked after my body, watched my diet, stayed off animal fats mainly. I eat like a horse, but I just don't eat animal fats if I can help it. I work on my mind, I work on my body, and I work on my game, and it's certainly been a great asset and a help to me.
Yeah, the way we look after it, that's my life. The longer I keep looking after my body, the longer I can play golf. And you know, I always like to keep my weight at a certain level. I feel as though my golf is...
How do you do that? Is it exercise or eating the right things?
Eating the right things, I think. You know, lots of times I just go and eat vegetables for a couple of days, and you know, Laura likes to do it that way, and I hardly ever have any fried food. So, you know, you pretty much take every hotel food and every restaurant you eat in, the food's basically the same anyway, so it's nice to get home and have home-cooked meals. And so out on the road, I basically like to eat as much fruit and cereal as possible, and that's it.
People have always treated me very nicely down here, and I've always enjoyed that. Enjoyed the hospitality and the respect that I've received, and I think that's been awfully nice. And I enjoy coming back here. Just, you know, I've played a lot of golf in Australia through the years, and I still enjoy coming here. And so it's hopefully it's not going to be my last visit.